For most of human history, cholera wasn't understood as a disease at all. The earliest descriptions likely stretch back thousands of years, recorded in ancient India. It would appear, vanish, then return again generations later, always the same, always sudden. By the time the modern world arrived, cholera had already killed millions. Across history, its victims likely number in the tens of millions. And still, no one knew what it was. Cholera didn't announce itself with wounds or fevers you could recognise. There was no obvious cause, no clear warning. It arrived quietly, and then it moved fast. It was a disease so deadly that a person could be perfectly healthy in the morning and dead by the following night. Entire households could disappear in days. Streets could empty in weeks. And to the people living through it, this didn't look like a medical problem. It looked like something far worse. A curse, a punishment, or simply fate. Doctors were confident, officials were certain. Everyone had an explanation. They were all wrong. By the time cholera reached Europe's great cities, doctors were not guessing, they were certain. The dominant theory was simple, intuitive, and disastrously wrong. Disease, they believed, spread through bad air, miasma. Rotting waste, stagnant water, foul smells rising from the ground. If something smelled sick, it was sick. It made sense. Cholera outbreaks followed filth. They flourished in crowded, impoverished neighbourhoods. The air there did smell worse, so the conclusion felt obvious. But what felt obvious wasn't what was true. Doctors focused on odours, not outcomes. They argued about vapours while people collapsed in the streets. Efforts were spent cleaning the air, burning chemicals, improving ventilation, masking smells, while the deaths continued unchanged. Worse still, the theory came with a convenient moral edge. If cholera thrived among the poor, then the poor themselves became part of the explanation. Their habits, their hygiene, their lives. Disease wasn't something happening to them, it was something they were blamed for causing. Confidence hardened into doctrine. Doctrine replaced evidence. And questioning it meant questioning authority itself. Cholera wasn't just killing people, it was being protected by certainty. Industrial cities weren't built with disease in mind. They were built for speed. People flooded in faster than infrastructure could adapt. Streets filled, tenements stacked higher. Waste had to go somewhere, and it did. Into cesspits, into rivers, into the same groundwater people drank from. Water wasn't treated, it was assumed safe. Wells were dug beside latrines. Sewage leaked through soil. Pumps drew from sources already contaminated, then distributed that water outward, efficiently, impartially, to thousands of homes. The city became a machine, not for living, but for transmission. What made cholera so lethal in cities wasn't just density, it was design. The very systems meant to sustain urban life, water, plumbing, shared access, quietly amplified the disease. And because the prevailing theory blamed air, none of this raised alarms. The smell was the problem. The water was invisible. As outbreaks exploded, officials searched for foul air drifting through neighbourhoods, while the real danger flowed silently through pipes and pumps, trusted, daily, unavoidable. The city didn't just fail to stop cholera, it learned how to spread it perfectly. At first, the deaths looked chaotic. People collapsed in their homes, in streets, in workplaces. Entire families vanished while neighbours survived untouched. It felt unpredictable, cruel, but consistent with the idea of a curse or poisoned air. But when outbreaks were looked at closely, something didn't quite fit. Some streets were devastated, others, only meters away, were barely touched. Buildings full of people would suffer heavy losses, while nearby buildings, similar in size, similar in poverty, remained largely intact. Certain households were hit repeatedly, others seemed almost immune. These weren't patterns doctors were trained to see. Medical thinking at the time focused on bodies, symptoms, and theory, not geography, not distribution, not numbers laid out on a page. Individual cases mattered, aggregates didn't. So these inconsistencies were dismissed as coincidence, or luck, or moral difference. But the deaths kept clustering. Not around smells, not around poverty alone, but around something far more ordinary, something everyone depended on, something no one thought to question. There was someone who looked at things differently. His name was John Snow. He was a physician working in London, trained to treat individual patients, but increasingly interested in something larger. Not the disease itself, but how it moved through the city. John Snow wasn't louder than his peers. He wasn't more forceful, and he didn't win debates. In fact, he largely avoided them. While others argued over theory, Snow did something unfashionable. He stopped trying to explain cholera and started trying to locate it. He didn't ask why people were dying. He asked where. Snow moved through the affected neighbourhoods, recording each death carefully, not as anecdotes, not as tragedies, as data points. Names, addresses, dates, one by one. This wasn't how medicine usually worked. Doctors treated patients. Snow treated the outbreak itself as the patient. Something spread across space, not contained in a single body. He didn't dismiss miasma directly. He didn't challenge authority head-on. He simply kept counting. And as the numbers grew, something began to take shape. Not a theory, a pattern. Snow took the deaths and changed the question medicine usually asked. Instead of asking what was killing people, he asked where death was happening. This was unusual. Medicine focused on bodies, symptoms, organs, theories. Snow treated the outbreak itself as something that occupied space, something that could be measured and plotted. So he mapped it. Each death became a mark beside an address. One by one, the city filled with data points. On their own, they meant nothing. Together, they told a story. The deaths were not random. They weren't drifting with the wind. They weren't spreading evenly through poverty. They were clustering tightly around a single public water pump, the Broad Street pump. The closer people lived to it, the more likely they were to die. The farther away they lived, the safer they became. Distance mattered more than belief, more than class, more than cleanliness. Even the exceptions obeyed the pattern. Workers who lived nearby but drank water elsewhere survived. A brewery next to the pump saw almost no deaths. Its workers drank beer instead of water. A large workhouse surrounded by disease remained largely untouched because it used a different well. Snow still didn't know what cholera was, but he had learned how it moved, and that was enough. This way of thinking, analysing disease by location, by clustering, by distance, is now called spatial epidemiology. At the time, it was simply counting, taken seriously. It's important to understand what Snow didn't know. This was decades before germ theory. No bacteria had been identified. No microscopes had revealed a hidden enemy in water. The idea that invisible organisms could cause disease was still speculative, often dismissed outright. Snow couldn't point to a microbe. He couldn't explain the mechanism. He had no biological proof. All he had was the pattern, and that was the problem. To many authorities, Snow's conclusion felt incomplete, even irresponsible. Removing the handle of a public water pump based on a map without knowing why it worked seemed like guesswork dressed up as science. The prevailing theories were coherent, familiar, comfortable. Snow's wasn't. It didn't explain the disease, it bypassed explanation entirely, and in doing so, it challenged something far deeper than a theory. It challenged the idea that understanding must come before action. Snow didn't convince the authorities by argument, he convinced them by exhaustion. The evidence kept pointing in the same direction, the deaths kept clustering around the same source. Eventually, reluctantly, officials agreed to act. The handle of the Broad Street pump was removed. There was no announcement, no declaration of discovery, no admission that prevailing theories were wrong. Just a small, practical intervention. And the deaths slowed. Not instantly, not magically, but enough to matter. Snow's explanation still wasn't accepted. Many believed the air had changed, or that the outbreak had simply run its course. The idea that water could carry disease remained deeply uncomfortable. But something had shifted. An intervention had worked without a complete explanation. Action had preceded certainty, and lives had been spared. Cholera didn't vanish, it would return. But this outbreak left behind something more durable than relief. A method. It didn't disappear from the world, and it didn't stop killing. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time, an ancient killer had been constrained, not by cure, not by theory, but by method. Snow's work became the foundation of a new way of thinking. Disease was no longer just something that happened to individuals. It was something that moved through populations, something that left patterns behind, something that could be measured. Snow didn't need a microscope to find the truth. He used a denominator. By comparing the number of deaths to the total number of houses served by each water company, he turned a chaotic tragedy into a clear ratio. In his grand experiment, he showed that houses drinking from sewage-polluted pipes had a death rate 8.5 times higher than those drinking from clean sources upstream. This wasn't a guess, it was a statistical certainty. This was the beginning of modern epidemiology. Not because cholera was finally understood, it wasn't, but because certainty was no longer required to act. Evidence, even incomplete, could be enough. Data could speak before biology arrived. Years later, the mechanism finally caught up with the math. The cause of cholera was identified as a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae, a microscopic organism that spreads when human waste contaminates drinking water. Sewage leaked into wells, latrines bled into groundwater, and what people drank carried what others had already excreted. It was real, it was physical, and it had been there all along. Snow never saw it, he never needed to. Germ theory would eventually confirm what his map had already proven through probability. The microscope arrived after the method. Explanation followed action. And that order matters, because it tells us something uncomfortable and something hopeful at the same time. Progress doesn't always come from insight. Sometimes it comes from restraint, from counting carefully, from admitting that you don't know why something works, only that it does. Cholera was not defeated by brilliance, it was weakened by humility. And in that quiet shift, from confidence to evidence, millions of lives would eventually be saved. Today we take John Snow's map for granted. Every time we look at a heat map, a trend line, or a data visualization, we're using his language, the idea that numbers can reveal what the human eye cannot. Snow's legacy wasn't just a pump handle in London, it was the realisation that when faced with a mystery, the most powerful tool isn't always better technology or louder arguments. Sometimes it's just a pencil, a map, and the patience to count. Because before we can solve a problem, we have to be willing to see it for what it actually is, not what we expect it to be. If this kind of hidden logic behind history interests you, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.